All right, diving into our fifth game of the match, Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann. If you like the London system or wild attacking chess, you don't want to miss this game because this game was crazy. Here, Magnus is playing as white. He opens with the London system with the key move bishop to f4. Now, this is a great opening for blitz. Magnus loves the London system. Of course, the idea is to go knight to f3, e3, bishop e2, castles, c3, have that pawn triangle in the middle of the board, and have a very easy game no matter what black does. Here, typically Hans Niemann does go for the line starting with move d5, followed by c5, but here he mixes things up. He goes for the move g6. Now, this is a more combative idea, at least in more imbalanced positions, but Hans Niemann typically doesn't play this way as black in this opening. Now here, Magnus, knight to f3, bishop g7, e3, castles, bishop e2. So far, super standard. Again, white's plan is simple. c3, castles, knight d2, a4, h3, all typical London system moves. But now here, black has to define what he's doing. Obviously, Hans Niemann is already castled, but now how is he going to get his counterplay going on the queen side and in the center? It's a few different ideas. For example, one idea is c5. That's very popular. Another idea is going d6, knight c6, and e5, trying to break in the center with that pawn chain on d6 and e5. Instead, Hans goes for a different idea, a slower approach, b6, intending bishop b7, fianchettoing the bishop on this long diagonal. Now, how does Magnus respond? He castles, and then he goes a4, expanding on the queen side. Now, this is a typical London system move. Of course, Magnus would normally follow up, say, h3, c3, knight d2, but he has a completely different idea in mind. Here, Hans Niemann, d6, standard idea. It's a good multi-purpose move. He may want to break on the queen side with c5, or in the center with e5 after, say, knight c6 or knight d7. But here, Magnus shows his idea. Instead of going for a more typical move like c3, he actually expands further on the queen side with the move a5. Now, this is already a little bit strange. This idea was popularized by the very powerful Google computer engine called AlphaZero, especially in his match during Stockfish. Here, Magnus Carlsen is actually threatening the idea of a6, trying to lock in that bishop back on the c8 square forever. Of course, if Magnus got that move in a6, it would be supported by both the bishop and the rook on the a1 square, meaning that move would actually work. And here, Hans Niemann ignores the threat. He goes knight d7. And this is a big mistake. Instead, he had to go simply knight to a6, blocking the pawn immediately. Instead, after knight d7, here Magnus again shows his idea. a6, the AlphaZero inspired move. Now the bishop has to move off this square here. Where's it going to go? If it goes to, say, c6, it's going to block that c7 pawn in forever. That's going to be terrible. Instead, bishop c8 is virtually forced, but now the bishop is blocked out of the game. The rook on the a8 square is also trapped. And here, Magnus Carlsen has a free hand to do pretty much whatever he wants in this position. Now, again, the standard idea would have been here c3, trying to get that pawn triangle in the middle of the board, staying safe and solid. However, because of this imbalance with the move a6 and the bishop being trapped, here Magnus can actually play for a very fast e4 break with the move knight to c3, and that is what he finds. Here again, the idea, potentially e4, potentially also d5, try to clamp down on those light squares. Of course, black's light squares on the queen side are so much weaker because of this a6 pawn wedge here. But here already, Magnus Carlsen already has a completely dominant position, at least from a positional perspective. Now, Hans Niemann, he's not out of the game. What does he do here? Well, he takes advantage of the fact that white has not played the move h3 yet. Normally, that move is played in the London system to give the bishop a retreat square on h2 if black goes knight to h5. However, here, without that move h3 on the board, knight to h5 is actually very, very strong. If white loses that dark squared bishop, his dark squares in the position are going to be so much weaker. So here, Magnus has to go bishop g5. Again, if you go bishop g3, then I can simply take it on the g3 square, and black's going to have a pretty decent game. Instead, bishop g5 on the board, the best move. Now Hans Niemann goes h6. Obviously, you don't want to go that Ben Feingold move f6. That would be way too weakening. And e5 is not really possible as that pawn is being pinned by the queen. So nothing there can be played. Instead, h6 on the board. Magnus goes back. Bishop h4. And here, there are a lot of threats based on discovered attacks on that knight on the h5 square. For example, if Hans Niemann goes g5, then Magnus Carlsen could take it on g5 or go something like knight d2 with a discovered attack on the knight as it's no longer defended by the g-pawn. And funnily enough, that is what Hans Niemann does here. He actually goes g5, and this is a big mistake. Real fast, instead of that, perhaps the best idea may have been c6, trying to shore up those light squares, maybe going d5 next. Instead, g5 on the board, and here Magnus has at least two really good ways to punish this move. The strongest idea, believe it or not, is knight takes g5, and the idea is not to try and win a knight on the h5 square. You basically go knight takes and then bishop takes, and you have a very vicious attack here as white. Black's pieces, especially those pieces on the queen side, are just way too passive, and white may be able to drum up a winning mating attack here. Instead, Magnus goes for the other option, just staying in control, a very good move, knight d2. Now, if Hans Niemann takes the bishop on the h4 square, then Magnus can win the knight on the h5 square, and then Black's pawn structure will be completely shattered. Now, there isn't really much else he can do. For example, if he retreats the knight back to the f6 square, then Magnus just goes bishop g3, and here Black's pawn structure on the king side with those pawns on h6 and g5 will be so much weaker. So instead, g takes h4 on the board, and Magnus takes the knight on the h5 square. Now here, Hans Niemann's pawns are incredibly weak. There are some lines of the king's Indian defense, especially when white goes for the move 3, f3, or the same-ish variation, and you reach sort of a Benini structure. Then this pawn structure with those pawns on h6 and h4 can be okay, as Black may have attacking chances with the pawn going to h3. But here, that is simply not the case, and Hans Niemann, again, is positioned going from bad to worse. Now, again, he's not out of the game. Here he finds the best idea, c6, intending perhaps d5 next, try to shore up those weakened light squares on the queen side. So, excellent idea. Here, Magnus retreats the bishop, bishop f3, bishop no longer being well placed on the h5 square, so it just goes back to a better square. Good idea. And then Hans d5. Again, excellent idea, trying to shore up those weakened light squares. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he's feeling ambitious. He wants to break in the center. He goes for it with the move e4. The solid idea, of course, if Black takes, white can recapture with either knight and have pretty good control over the center of the board, and Black's pawns are still going to be weak. Now here, Hans Niemann, instead of taking, he goes e6. Now, this move is technically playable, but it's a little bit passive. Now, d takes e4 was not the best idea. Again, Magnus can recapture with either knight with a terrific game. Instead, the key idea for Black, believe it or not, is the move e5. Just trying to blow open the center right away. And remember here, Black does have the bishop pair. If he can open up the position, his bishops are going to be incredibly powerful. And it turns out, if he found this move e5 right here, he would have had a roughly level game. Instead, e6 on the board. Now, the problem with this move is Magnus Carlsen can simply expand in the center with the move e5. Then we reach sort of a French defense-style structure. However, this would be very favorable for Magnus Carlsen. Black's pawns on the king side are weak. That pawn on the queen side restricts Black's bishop. There's no good way to try and win the pawn. It would take too much time. So here, white's always going to have that threat of e5 in the future. Now, e5 right away isn't as strong. Here, Black actually gets a great game right away with the move c5, trying to undermine white's center. However, Magnus can prepare this move, and he does, with the idea knight to e2. Now his center is just way better supported. He always has that resource c3, bolstering the d4 pawn if he needs to bolster it in the future. And now he is ready for that e5 idea. Now here, Hans, instead of sitting back and waiting for the inevitable, he latches out on the king side, queen to g5. Not the best move, but I actually like this from a practical standpoint. This is a blitz game. The initiative is everything. Maybe Hans Niemann can make use of that pawn on the h4 square, perhaps going h3 at some point. So I like this idea. Now Magnus, rook to e1, Hans Niemann, king to h8. And here, Magnus shows his flair. He finds a very creative idea. Not the strongest computer move, but I really like this move. Rook to a3, transferring the rook up to the third rank, a rook lift, and now the rook can swing over to the king side at some point in the future. So there are just all sorts of scenarios where this rook move could be incredibly useful. It's a very good idea to keep in mind for your own games. Now here, Hans Niemann goes knight to f6, trying to transfer the knight over to the king side. However, this move jumps into the idea e5. This hits the knight with tempo. Magnus didn't find this in the game, but that would have been super, super strong. Instead here, Magnus g3, trying to stop any ideas on this g-file. stopping h3 ideas, just trying to stay safe and solid. Now here, Hans Niemann, he can make use of that knight on the f6 square. The key idea is knight takes e4. However, he misses that, bishop d7, and this is a very weak idea. The knight no longer has access to the d7 square as it's occupied by the bishop. Magnus spots this immediately and goes for an e5, the best move. Now here, his position went from good to amazing. Where is the knight going to go? Literally all of these squares here are absolutely awful. If the knight goes to h5, it's going to be vulnerable to bishop takes h5 ideas in the future. Where is Hans going to put the knight? In the game, he goes knight g8, about as good a move as any, and now Magnus simply bishop g2, an excellent idea. Here's one of the ideas of the move. If black ever goes h takes g3, you don't have to respond f takes or h takes. Instead, you can actually go rook takes g3, and suddenly you're the one attacking black on the king side, not the other way around. And that is what happens here. G takes, and then rook takes g3 from Magnus Carlsen, the best idea, showing the full idea of rook to a3 in the first place. Now, of course, there is no way to block the attack. Black has to move the queen back. Queen to e7 looks as good as any other move. But now, knight to f4, Magnus threatening knight to h5, and if he gets that move in uncontested, that bishop on the g7 square, believe it or not, there is literally no way here for Hans Niemann to defend the piece. And that is what happens in the game. Queen to h4 from Hans Niemann, and then Magnus knight to h5, threatening either knight takes or rook takes on g7. The bishop can't move. The only square it has is f6, and then it gets lost to either e takes or knight takes, and there's no way for Hans Niemann to defend the piece. So for that reason, he's losing a piece on the spot, and here Hans Niemann on move 25 resigns to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a display by Magnus, but don't go anywhere. The last game features that new opening that I teased in the intro.